Part 1, the funeral shoes. My father's funeral was on a Tuesday. It was raining. Not the kind of dramatic storm that makes you cry just watching it, but a dull, drizzling rain that seeps into your shoes and the seams of your coat and makes everything feel heavier than it already is. I remember standing in the back, slightly to the left of the casket, holding my daughter's hand so tightly that she looked up at me and whispered, "Mommy, it hurts." I let go immediately, murmured a soft sorry, and tried to smile. She was 2, young to understand what was really happening, or maybe not. Children have their own way of knowing things without words, without explanation. They read the grief in your silence and the tension in your shoulders better than any adult ever could. My mother sat in the front row, pale and still. Her hands, the same ones that once tucked me in every night, now folded neatly in her lap. Unmoving, I had the sudden urge to sit beside her, to reach for them again the way I did when I was little. But instead, I stayed in the back with my daughter. My space now belonged here. It had been 4 years since I'd come home. And in those 4 years, the house I grew up in had quietly rearranged itself without me. My father's chair no longer faced the TV, but the window. The wall that used to be covered in my childhood drawings had been repainted a sterile off-white, like the inside of a hospital. The fridge was covered in magnets shaped like vegetables now. None of them mine. After the burial, people gathered. In the house like they always do. Quiet murmurs, plates of store-bought cookies, and the clinking of coffee spoons on porcelain. The same rhythm of grief passed down from generation to generation. Everyone knows what to do. No one knows what to say, except my mother. She didn't say a word. Not even when I stood beside her in the kitchen and asked, gently, "Do you want me to help with the coffee?" She nodded once. Barely. It was the first time we had stood that close in years. Later that evening, when everyone had gone and the house was quiet enough to hear the creak of the floorboards again, I found my daughter sitting on the edge of the guest bed, holding one of my old stuffed animals. "This used to be yours?" she asked. I nodded. She hugged it like it had always belonged to her. Then she looked up at me and said, "Mommy? Who tucked you in when you were little?" I didn't answer right away, because the truth was, I didn't remember. Not clearly. Not in the way my daughter would remember me. I remembered bedtime stories cut short, kisses on the forehead given in passing, a sense of being loved, yes, but at a distance, as though I'd been raised by people who did their best, but always had somewhere else to be. When I finally spoke, I said Grandma did, when she could. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. That night, after I tucked my daughter in, I wandered down the hallway to the linen closet and opened the bottom drawer. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for, maybe a blanket, maybe a memory. But what I found instead was a box I hadn't seen in years. My father's shoebox. The one he used to keep old cards, receipts, scraps of paper with phone numbers, and something else, photographs, black and white. Faded at the corners, I opened it slowly, as if afraid the memories inside might crumble if I moved too fast. And there it was, a photo of my mother, holding me when I was no older than 2. Her hair was pulled back, her eyes tired. But there was something in the way her fingers curled around my back, gentle, protective, almost desperate. I stared at that photo for a long time, because I'd forgotten she ever held me that way. And suddenly, I wasn't sure if it was her I had distanced myself from, or a version of her I built in my mind over time. A colder version, a tougher one who didn't need soft hands or warm hugs. I pressed the photo to my chest, and for the first time since I got the call that my father had passed, I cried, quietly. In the hallway, alone. Until I felt it again, my daughter's tiny hand slipping into mine from behind. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her hand was warm. Like mine. Like my mother's once was. Part 2, her coffee was always bitter the next morning. The kitchen felt colder than it should have. It wasn't the weather, though. The early spring air still bit. At the window panes, it was something else. The kind of cold that comes from silence sitting too long in the corners of a room. A chill born not from temperature, But from too many things left unsaid for too many years, I stood in my childhood kitchen, barefoot on the worn tile floor, watching the coffee drip slowly into the pot. My mother had always taken her coffee black. No sugar, bitter. Like her tone on most mornings of my teenage years, I poured 2 mugs anyway. When I placed hers on the table, she looked at it for a moment before finally speaking. "You still make it too weak," I smiled, faintly. "And you still take it like medicine." She didn't smile back, just took a sip. The silence between us wasn't sharp anymore. It had dulled over the years into something heavy and padded, like old blankets in a forgotten attic. We both had things we wanted to say, maybe even needed to say, but we folded them up neatly and tucked them back into the corners of our hearts instead. "Your father liked it sweet," she said suddenly. 3 sugars. I never understood how he drank it like that. I blinked. Not because the information surprised me, but because she said it at all. A small memory. A thread. I held onto it. He used to sneak cookies after dinner when you weren't. Looking, I added dot, and just like that, there it was, a crack in the wall. She chuckled, barely. The sound was so brief and unfamiliar, I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. But I saw it in the way her shoulders eased, just a little. It was something dot after breakfast. I took my daughter out to the backyard, the same yard where I used to make clover crowns and catch fireflies. The swing set was still there, rusted, one chain slightly shorter than the other. "Did you play here when you were little?" she asked. "All the time." She smiled. "Then it must remember you." I turned to look at the swing, then at her. "Maybe it does." And maybe that's why it groaned when I sat down on it later after she had gone inside. The metal creaked, familiar and resistant, like the past itself. I rocked gently, back and forth, and stared at the house I once called home. From that angle, I could see into the kitchen window, and I saw her, my mother, standing at the sink, holding something in her hand. A small towel, or maybe a napkin. She wasn't drying dishes. She was just holding it, staring out. She looked old. I don't know why that hit me so hard. Maybe because I'd spent most of my adult life convincing myself she was made of stone and yielding, cold, unchanging. But in that moment, she looked soft. Tired human later that night. After my daughter fell asleep with the stuffed bear tucked tightly under her chin, I stepped into the hallway and paused outside the door to my parents' bedroom. It was slightly ajar. The room smelled the same, like cedarwood and old paperbacks. Like him, she was sitting on the edge of the bed, brushing her hair. I stood there silently, unsure if she'd seen me. "I used to braid your hair before school," she said softly, "even when you said you didn't want me to." I swallowed. "I remember. You'd huff and roll your eyes, but you always sat still for it. I liked it," I admitted. "I just didn't know how to tell you." She placed the brush on the nightstand, hands folded neatly in her lap again. "It's hard to say the right things at the right time," she said. "Harder than I thought it would be." I stepped into the room. "Why didn't you try more?" I asked. "When I got older, when I pulled away, why didn't you pull back?" She looked up at me, then really looked. And in her eyes, I saw something that looked a lot like guilt, but not shame. Just, "Wait, because I thought if I gave you space, you'd come back when you were ready." Her voice cracked slightly. "But then years passed, and when you didn't come back, I told myself you didn't want to." The room was so quiet. Even the dust seemed to hang in stillness. "I didn't know how to come back," I whispered. "I still don't." She reached across the blanket and placed her hand over mine. Her skin was cool, thinner than I remembered. "But steady. Then stay," she said. "Just for a little while." I nodded, and for the first time in a long, long time, I felt like a daughter again. Part 3, the braided photograph. The next morning, I found a photograph slipped under my bedroom door. It wasn't in a frame, just loosely tucked inside a clear plastic sleeve, like something pulled from a box of keepsakes someone had forgotten. How to part with Dot? It was me, 9 years old. sitting on the back porch, legs tucked under, with my hair in 2 braids that ran thick down my shoulders. My mother's hands were in the shot too, caught mid-motion as she twisted the strands. She wasn't looking at the camera, but at me. And there was something in her expression, half-focused, half-tender, that made me catch my breath. It was one of the only photos I'd ever seen of her looking at me that way. I couldn't tell if it made me feel comforted or mournful. The sleeve smelled faintly like cedar wood, the same scent as their bedroom, the scent of my father's sweaters, the scent of boxes sealed for years. I carried the photo down to the kitchen, where she was already brewing coffee black, as always. I didn't know this picture existed, I said, holding it out to her. She glanced at it. You wouldn't. Your father took it. He said you looked happiest when you were still. I didn't agree. I laughed softly. I was a quiet kid. No, she said, pouring her coffee. You were loud, in your own way. You just never said things out loud. She sat, folding one leg under the other like she always used to, and took a slow sip. I used to worry about that, she added. Your silence, it reminded me of myself, and I didn't want that for you. I sat across from her. The kitchen light was warm, golden. Outside, the sky was soft and gray again, like grief that hadn't decided whether to stay or go. I was angry with you for a long time, I said, voice barely above a whisper. She didn't flinch. She just nodded slowly and set her mug down with care. I know, she said. I didn't always know how to mother you. I think I mothered you the way I wanted to be mothered myself, quietly, cautiously, without too much softness. I thought it would make you stronger. There was no accusation in her tone, just fact. And regret sitting at the edge of every word. But you were always strong, she continued, even when you weren't. I didn't know what to say to that, so I looked down at my hands instead, the same ones I'd seen holding her cup. Flipping the photograph, brushing my daughter's hair just the night before. They look like hers now. The shape, the bones, even the way the veins curved faintly beneath the skin. You know what I remember? I said suddenly. I remember you always brushing my hair too hard. It used to hurt. She gave a half smile. You had knots like barbed wire. I didn't have the patience for gentleness back then. We both went quiet. Then she added, I would do it differently now. I looked up. Everything, she said. If I could go back, I would hold you longer, braid slower, I would listen more. I felt the breath catch in my throat, because there it was, the apology I didn't even know I needed. It didn't come with a grand gesture or tearful embrace. Just a soft admission in the kitchen. Over bitter coffee and an old photo, I reached for her hand. She looked surprised. At first stopped, but then her fingers closed over mine, and it felt somehow like both an ending and a beginning. Later that day, I took my daughter to the park at the end of the street, the same one I used to walk to as a child when I needed to breathe or cry or be anywhere but home. The benches were rusted. The swings creaked just like the old ones in the backyard. As we walked back toward the house, my daughter looked up at me and asked, was Grandma always this quiet? I smiled. She's not quiet. She's just learning how to speak a different kind of love. She furrowed her brow. What kind? The kind that takes time. That night, before bed, I brushed my daughter's hair, slowly, gently. Even the knots. She didn't complain once. When I tucked her in, she looked up at me and whispered, You're softer now, Mommy. And I thought of my own mother's hands fumbling. Firm, not always tender. But trying counts for something. Trying is a kind of love, too. Part 4. The letter in the drawer the next morning was quiet. Too quiet, the kind of hush that settles over a house after the rituals of mourning have passed, once the casseroles stop arriving, and the phone calls fade into polite condolences. No one knows how to answer anymore. My daughter was still sleeping. Her breathing, soft and slow, drifted from the guest room like a lullaby held over from the night before. I lingered outside her door for a moment, listening. Then I turned toward the master bedroom. Toward the drawer I hadn't opened since before the funeral. My father's drawer. It had always been his space, tidy, tucked, organized in a way that said he needed order in a world full of mess. I remembered him folding socks with military precision, stacking pens, smoothing receipts. The drawer had felt off limits as a child. And even now I hesitated, but grief does strange things. It makes you want to know more than you did. It makes you reach into the past and hope it reaches. Back. The drawer stuck slightly at first, then gave, inside, old reading glasses, a leather watch strap worn at the buckle, a yellowed notepad with the first few pages torn out, and then folded twice and tucked beneath a small jewelry box, a letter. I didn't mean to read it. I really didn't, but my fingers moved before my mind did. The paper was soft from age, the ink slightly smudged near the edges. It wasn't dated, just signed to Eleanor. It began. I don't know if I'll ever be brave enough to say these things aloud, so I'm writing them down in case something happens to me before I find the words. You were never easy to love, but you loved deeply. And I didn't always know how to receive that. I often wondered if we chose each other because we didn't know how not to. But I do know this. Everything that softened in me was because of you. And everything that stayed hard was mine to carry, not yours to fix. Forgive me for the silences, for the nights I sat in that chair and said nothing when I should have reached for your hand. I loved you, even when I forgot how to say it. Especially then, Jay, I read it twice. Then a third time. It wasn't addressed to me, but it was about her. My mother. And in a way, it was about me too. Because all my life I'd watched their marriage. Like someone peering through a fogged-up window seeing outlines, but never the full picture. I thought he had grown distant with time, that she had hardened out of defense, that they'd coexisted more than they'd connected. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe love for them was quieter than I'd understood, and more complicated. I placed the letter back exactly where I found it, though I knew it wouldn't sit the same again. I wasn't sure if she knew it existed. I wasn't sure if I should tell her. When I turned around, she was standing at the doorway, still in her robe, barefoot, holding a cup of coffee with two hands, like she needed both to keep from spilling. Her eyes dropped to the drawer, then back to mine. I didn't know he kept that, she said softly. He never said. I felt my cheeks flush. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. No, she interrupted. I'm glad you did. She stepped inside, her footsteps quieter than I remembered. The room smelled like her lotion lavender and something faintly citrusy, the kind she used only when guests were over. She sat on the edge of the bed, looked down at her hands. He wasn't perfect, she said. God knows we weren't, but I think, in the end, he tried to leave behind something that made sense. I sat beside her, not touching, just... Mir, you never told me what you were like before him, I said. I don't know if I'd recognize her, she replied, but she was softer and scared and hopeful. She looked at me then, and you were all of those things too once. I didn't know if that was meant to comfort me or cut me open. Maybe both. That night, as I folded laundry in the room where I used to sleep beneath posters that had long been taken down, found an old t-shirt I hadn't worn since college. Still faintly smelled like dorm rooms and coconut shampoo, and I wondered how much of who we used to be still lives inside the people we've become. I held the shirt to my chest, felt a weight I hadn't named yet. Outside, my daughter was giggling in her sleep, and for the first time in days, I smiled, because maybe memory is its own kind of forgiveness. Part 5. The scar on her wrist, I noticed it while we were washing dishes. A faint line, pale against the skin, just above her wrist bone. Not new, but not old enough to be forgotten. She moved her hands quickly, almost deliberately, as if she didn't want me to see. But I'd already seen it. We hadn't spoken much that afternoon. The air between us was thick with polite tasks. Fold this, wipe that, check on my daughter who had curled up on the living room floor with picture books she couldn't yet read. It had been a long day. The kind that asks nothing of you and still leaves you tired. But when I saw that scar, something in me shifted. A question formed. Then, hesitated Dot, she rinsed the last plate and handed it to me without looking. "Mom," I said gently, "how did you get that scar?" She stilled, just for a moment. And that was enough. Dot, her shoulders straightened. Her mouth drew tight. "I don't remember," she said. "A lie, but not a cruel one. Just an old protective kind." I dried the plate and set it in the rack. We stood in silence again. The kind of silence that carries a heartbeat. "I used to think you were made of iron," I said, not looking at her. Dot, she half laughed. "I used to think I had to be." She leaned on the counter, hands curled loosely in front of her. Her nails were short, no polish. A practical woman's hands. "I was 24 when I married your father," she began quietly. "And I thought that made me an adult. I didn't know then that adulthood has nothing to do with age and everything to do with loss." I looked at her, really looked. She wasn't the same woman from my childhood memories, the one who could cut down a room with a single look, who always seemed just out of reach. She looked tired, but in a softer way. "What did you lose?" I asked softly. She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "Myself, for a while." The weight of that answer settled between us like a folded coat quiet. Worn, familiar. She turned toward me, drying her hands slowly with the towel I'd left near the sink. Her voice lowered. "That scar, it wasn't what you think." It wasn't a cry for help. It was just ... A moment when I didn't want to feel anything at all. I didn't respond. Because there are some stories you don't interrupt. I was alone in the house. You were still little, maybe 3. And your father was working long hours at the plant, trying to make ends meet. We had bills. I was exhausted, and God, you cried so much back then. Colic, they said. But it was more than that. You felt everything." I let her keep going, and I remember standing at the sink, doing dishes. Just like this. And the water was too hot, and the baby monitor was hissing. And I looked at that drawer where the sharp knives were, and I thought just for a second, what if? She paused, breathing. "I didn't do anything. Not really, just scraped my skin, just enough to feel something different." I felt my throat tighten, not with judgment, but with a wave of grief for a version of her I had never known. I didn't know. I whispered, "You weren't supposed to, but I wish I had." She turned toward me then, and I saw something I hadn't seen in her eyes in years. Not strength, not sorrow, just vulnerability. The quiet kind that waits its whole life to be seen. "You were always watching," she said, "even when I thought you weren't." My daughter came into the kitchen then, rubbing her eyes with one hand and holding her bear with the other. She reached for me instinctively, curling into my side. "She okay?" my mother asked. "She just doesn't like waking up in a quiet house." She nodded. "You were like that too." I looked at her, and for the first time I realized that I hadn't just inherited her eyes, her hands, her stubbornness. I'd inherited her silences too. That night after my daughter went to bed, I sat at the edge of the mattress with the photograph from the other day, still on my lap, the one where she braided my hair, and I traced the shape of her. Hands in the picture, hands that I wanted to give more. Hands that had once trembled under the weight of trying to be enough. I placed the photo gently under my pillow and whispered into the dark, "I see you now." Part 6, the locked room there. Was always one room in the house that stayed closed. It wasn't locked with a key, just closed in the way things sometimes are in families, without explanation, without fanfare. You simply learn not to go there. As a child, I called it the room with the blue door, though it had been painted white for as long as I could remember. And now, with my father gone and silence softening the walls between us, I found myself standing in front of that door again. I reached for the handle. It wasn't locked. The hinges creaked as I opened it, releasing a rush of cool, still air like stepping into memory itself. The room was dim, heavy curtains drawn, dust suspended. In the shafts of light slicing through the blinds, a twin bed, a dresser with peeling paint, a rocking chair facing the window. It was clearly a child's room, long abandoned, yet preserved with quiet care. I stepped inside, uncertain. There were no toys, no drawings on the walls. Just a single shelf of old children's books, and on the dresser, a glass frame with a photograph. A boy, maybe 8, standing beside my mother, her hand on his shoulder. Her smile faint and tired. I stared at it for a long time before turning as I heard her voice behind me. You weren't supposed to find that. She didn't sound angry, only resigned. I turned to face her. Who was he? She stepped inside, slowly brushing her fingers along the edge of the rocking chair as if it might fall apart from disuse. His name was Matthew. She paused. I was 19 when I had him. My breath caught. You had a son? She nodded. And he died, she added, her voice nearly lost in the quiet of the room. I didn't speak, because what words are there when the person you thought you knew completely reveals an entire chapter of herself you never even imagined? He was sick, born with a heart defect. He didn't make it past 9. I looked at the bed, at the books, at the light gathering like dust on the windowsill. Why didn't you ever tell me? I asked, not accusing, just broken open. She sat in the rocking chair, hands resting in her lap. Because grief rearranges you. And for a long time, I didn't have room for anything but survival. When I had you, I thought I could bury all of it, but it didn't bury. It just settled into my bones. I sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress groaning under my weight. I imagined the shape of him curled beneath that very blanket. A boy who would have been my brother. A name never spoken at the dinner table. A shadow I'd grown up beside, without even knowing it. You said I cried a lot, I whispered. Was that why? She looked at me then, and her eyes shimmered. With something I hadn't seen before. Shame, perhaps. Or the ache of remembering what she had tried not to feel. I was scared, she said. Terrified that I would lose you too. So I stayed distant. I thought if I didn't get too close, it would hurt less if I had to say goodbye again. I stared at her small, tired frame curled into that chair like she'd sat there every night for years, rocking memories into silence. And suddenly, so many things made sense. Her stiffness, her fear, the way she never quite reached out, but always hovered near. Mom, I said, I wish you told me. I know, she whispered, but I didn't know how. We sat there for a long time, me on the bed, her in the rocking chair, and Matthew between us in every unspoken word. Eventually, she stood, walked to the dresser, and opened the top drawer. Inside were a few folded shirts, a tiny pair of sneakers, still tied, and beneath them a sketchbook. She handed it to me. He used to draw birds. Said they were the only things that didn't look sad. I opened the pages carefully. Sparrows, owls, cranes. Wings wide open. My throat tightened. I closed the sketchbook and held it to my chest. I would have liked him, I said softly. She nodded. He would have loved you. I rose to leave, but paused at the door. Do you still come in here? Only when I miss him, she said, which is most days. That night I couldn't sleep. So I sat by my daughter's bedside, watching her breathe. Her face was peaceful, soft, whole. And in that moment, I realized something I never fully understood before. My mother didn't raise me out of coldness. She raised me with hands that had already let go once, and never stopped fearing they might have to let go again. Part 7, when the windows stayed closed, it rained all morning. Not a dramatic storm, but the kind of persistent drizzle that muffles sound and makes everything feel farther away. The kind of rain that settles into your bones, making you think of things you haven't thought about in years. I sat on the window bench with a blanket draped over my shoulders, a cup of tea cooling in my hands. My daughter had fallen asleep again on the couch, her body curled around her bear like It was the only thing she trusted dot and across the room. My mother was folding laundry with quiet precision fold, smooth, stack, repeat. Like muscle memory. Like ritual. I used to hate rainy days, I said aloud, not expecting an answer. She looked up from the towel in her hands. You always said it made everything feel small. It still does. She folded another towel, neatly, like she was folding the edges of her own discomfort. You know, I continued, I used to lie awake at night listening to the wind. I thought if it blew hard enough, it might crack the windows and carry me away. A pause. You never told me that, she said. I shrugged. You never asked. That silence hung between us like mist on the glass. She placed the folded towels in a basket and sat down across from me. Her hands rested in her lap, still as stone. Her eyes were softer today, maybe because the light was gray. Maybe because some part of her was finally letting go of the weight she carried alone for too long. I didn't ask, she said, because I didn't think I was allowed to. That startled me. You were my mother, I said. You were supposed to ask. She looked out the window then, her voice quieter than before. When I was little, my mother didn't ask me much. Either she believed in keeping her chin up, keeping her shoes polished, and keeping her pain to herself. I didn't know any other way to be a mother. It wasn't an excuse. It was an inheritance, and suddenly I saw a line stretching back not just to her, but to a woman I'd never met. My grandmother, a woman whose rules still echoed in the way this house had been kept. Closed curtains, folded sheets, polite distance. I didn't want to raise you like that, she added. But when you were small and I felt lost, I just defaulted, and then the years passed, and it got harder to change. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how. Grief doesn't always come in loud sobs. Sometimes it looks like two women in their 50s and 30s, sitting across from each other, both wishing they could rewind to the same night, maybe a Tuesday when one was crying, and the other was too afraid to knock on the door. I used to draw things, I said finally, when I was a kid, to get your attention. She looked at me, eyes searching. I'd leave them on the kitchen counter. Little notes, sketches, I even drew you once. She was quiet. I remember, she said. I kept them. My eyes met. Hers, I didn't think you noticed. I always noticed, she whispered. I just didn't know how to say it mattered. Outside, the rain pressed gently against the windows, not demanding, just reminding. You still have them? I asked, she nodded. In the cedar chest, under my scarves. A long silence passed. Then she said, I'm not good with feelings. You know that, but I've always wanted to be better. I smiled faintly. You are. And I meant it. Later, I opened the cedar chest in her bedroom while she sat beside me, knees close, breath steady. I pulled back the scarves one by one like turning pages in a book we had both forgotten how to read. And there they were, crumpled papers, childish drawings in crayon and pen. One was a lopsided heart with my name and hers inside it. Another was just a sentence, scrawled in my best 9-year-old handwriting. I miss you when you're quiet. She closed her eyes when she saw that one, pressed her hand to her chest, and for the first time, I watched my mother cry not with noise, not with shame. Just tears falling quietly down her face as she held that old paper like something holy. I never stopped loving you, she said. I know, I whispered. And I did, finally. I knew not because she had said it clearly, but because she had kept the drawings. Because she had handed me the letter. Because she had begun to open rooms she had kept locked for decades. That night, I sat at the end of the bed with a journal on my lap, and I wrote, My mother taught me to be strong. But only now is she teaching me how to be soft. Part 8. Things we don't say out loud. We never talked about my father after he died. There was a photo of him on the mantel. A few muted acknowledgments. Your father would have liked this soup. Or he always forgot to refill the gas tank. But nothing whole. Nothing honest. My daughter asked about him one evening while helping me set the table. Did Grandpa like kids? I froze with a spoon still in my hand. My mother looked up from her chair, where she'd been peeling potatoes with careful precision. She didn't answer. So I did. He was quiet, honey, I said. But I think he liked them in his own way. She tilted her head. Did he ever play with me? You were really little. She frowned. I don't remember. My mother's hand slowed. He wasn't much for playing, she said softly. But he used to read to you every night you were here, even when you couldn't understand the stories yet. My daughter brightened. He did? My mother nodded. He'd sit in that old brown chair with you tucked under his arm. Read you poetry sometimes, or old newspaper articles. You'd fall asleep with your hand wrapped around his thumb. I watched my daughter try to imagine that. I was trying to imagine it too, because somehow I had no memory of it either. After dinner, when my daughter had gone to bed, I stayed in the kitchen while my mother washed dishes. I didn't know he did that, I said quietly. She didn't look at me. He had his own way of showing love. It was just understated, like everything else about him. There was a pause. Then I asked the question I hadn't dared to ask since the funeral. Were you happy with him? She turned off the water, dried her hands on a towel, then leaned back against the counter. No, she said, not always. I nodded slowly. But I wasn't unhappy either, she added. I looked up. He was steady, predictable. He didn't make big gestures, but he never walked away. He was there even when he didn't know how to be what I needed. Her voice grew quieter, and I stayed, even when I felt lonely in the same room with him. That's not love, I said. No, she agreed. But it's what I understood of it at the time. I let that settle, because somewhere deep inside I realized I had lived out the same pattern once, years ago. Staying with someone not because it felt full, but because it felt familiar. I had called it stability. But it had been silence. He used to write you letters, my mother said, as if pulling the memory from a drawer she rarely opened. When? He worked nights. I found some in his coat pocket once. Half finished, like he meant to give them to you, but never got around to it. I blinked. Letters, she nodded. He never mailed them. But he kept writing. I suddenly remembered his handwriting. Angular, careful, the kind of man who underlined newspaper headlines and circled dates in the margins. I think he loved you, she said, more than he knew how to show. Later that night, I went looking through old boxes in the attic. Dust-covered bins labeled in his tidy, unmistakable script. Tools, tax stocks, keepsakes. And there, beneath a bundle of receipts and warranties from the 90s, I found them. A small stack of yellowing papers, folded carefully, each one addressed at the top. To Ellie. He had never called me that aloud. But here in ink, the name felt tender. I didn't read them all. Not yet, just the first. You're 7 today. You told me at breakfast that you want to be a detective when you grow up. You said it with such certainty, I believed you. I hope you never lose that voice. I'm sorry I missed your dance recital. I told your mother it was traffic, but it wasn't. It was nerves. I'm not good at big crowds. I'm not good at clapping at the right time. But I'm proud of you, even if I say it quietly. I folded it slowly and cried, not for what he'd done wrong, but for everything he tried to do right and never told me. When I came downstairs, my mother was waiting in the dark. You found them? She asked. I nodded. You still want to know if I was happy? Yes, she looked away, then said something that would stay with me for a long time. I think I was ... in my own way. But more than anything, I was trying. And I think that counts. For something, trying. The word echoed through me because that's what we'd all been doing. My father, my mother. And now me, trying to love without always knowing how. Trying to heal what we never had words for. And maybe In the end, trying is its own kind of devotion. Part 9, the way she looked at me, there was a moment, sometime during my teenage years, when I decided I didn't want to become her. I didn't say it out loud. I just felt it sharp and silent, like a splinter under the skin. I watched the way she folded clothes with mechanical precision, the way she answered the phone with the same rehearsed cheer no matter how tired she looked, the way she made dinner without ever sitting down to enjoy it. It wasn't that she was cold. It was that she always seemed unfinished, like someone who had set herself aside a long time ago and forgotten where she placed the rest. That morning, while my daughter played quietly on the carpet with a box of wooden blocks, I watched my mother move around the kitchen with that same quiet purpose. She poured coffee, sliced apples, checked the weather on her phone. Still careful, still efficient, still folded inward. And I thought about that teenage version of me, so sure I'd never end up like her. But now, in my 30s, with tired eyes and a back that ached from cradling too much weight, physical, emotional, generational, I wasn't so sure anymore. Maybe I hadn't become her. But I had become a woman who carried things silently, and I wasn't sure which of us I was angry with for that. Mom, I said quietly, do you remember my 10th birthday? She looked up. A flicker of hesitation crossed her face. Asked for chocolate cake, she said, but I bought lemon because that's what your father liked. I nodded. I cried in the garage. She stopped moving. You slammed the door, she whispered. I thought it was because you were being dramatic. I was, but also, I just wanted to feel like I mattered. Silence stretched between. U.S. like a bridge we didn't know how to cross. I'm sorry, she said. That whole year you felt far away. Like I was parenting a stranger. I felt like one. She came to sit across from me at the table. No coffee. No defenses. I didn't know how to reach you, she said. Every time I tried, you rolled your eyes or walked away. I smiled faintly. Yeah, I was good at that. You were furious, she continued, and I didn't know how to name it. I think, I said slowly, I just wanted you to see me. Not just the chores or the grades or how late I got home. Me, the girl who was scared of not being good enough. The girl who wanted to be hugged instead of lectured. The girl who didn't want to become like you. Because I thought being you meant being invisible. Her face didn't change, but her eyes did. I always saw you, she said, even when I didn't know how to say it. I looked down at my hands. I'd spent years building walls. But now, brick by brick, they were crumbling. I think I copied you more than I realized, I admitted. I became quiet when things hurt. I made coffee instead of talking. I told myself I was strong, but really, I was just scared to ask for comfort. She reached across the table and placed her hand on mine. Her skin was dry and warm. And for a second, we didn't feel like mother and daughter. We felt like two women trying to forgive the versions of themselves they'd once needed to be. When you were born, she said softly, I looked at you and thought, she's going to be better than me. I swallowed. That's a heavy hope to give a child, she nodded. I see that now. We sat quietly, her hands still on mine. I always wondered, I whispered, why you didn't tell me you were proud of me more often. Her eyes grew glassy. Because I thought I had to be tough. That if I got too soft, you wouldn't be strong enough for the world. But I didn't want to be tough, I said. I just wanted to be loved out loud. She nodded once, twice, then said something that almost broke me. I loved you the only way I knew. But I'm learning another. Wait, if you'll let me try. I squeezed her hand. Me too. And it wasn't forgiveness exactly. But it was the beginning of something better. That evening, my daughter drew a picture of the three of us. Her, me, and grandma's stick figures holding hands under a scribbled sun. She handed it to my mother. This is you, she said proudly. You have the biggest smile. My mother stared at it for a long time. Then, slowly, her face softened. That's not how I've always looked, she murmured. But maybe it's how you'll look now, I offered Dot, and for the first time. I saw her smile like someone who believed she still had time to change. Part 10. The letter from the library was tucked into a book. A thin yellowed envelope, barely held together at the corners, slid from between the pages of an old poetry collection my mother had brought down from the attic. She'd said she wanted to donate them. No one reads these anymore, but I wasn't so sure. There was a hesitation in her hands when she passed them to me, like she wasn't just giving up books, but something older. Something she'd once clung to. I opened the book out of curiosity. Pablo Neruda. Love poems. Dot, and then the envelope slipped. Out. Her name was written on the front. Not Mom, not Mrs. Just Anne? I froze. She looked up from across the room and saw it instantly. Dot, her face didn't show panic. Only a quiet resignation, like she had always known this day would. Come, you can read it, she said. I think I'm done keeping it secret. I unfolded it slowly. The ink had faded, but the words were still clear. And I've tried to forget you, but there are lines I still hear in my sleep. The way you laughed into your scarf. The way you refused to cry in front of me, even when your hands were shaking. I was wrong to ask you to stay when your heart had already gone home. I hope your daughter has your strength, but not your silence. I hope she knows how lucky she is. Love. I read it again, Dot, and again. Then I looked up. Who's M? She was quiet. Then, Mark, I asked. You mean? She nodded. Before your father. Before everything. He was the one I didn't choose. I didn't speak. I just listened. Because suddenly I knew this was a story she had waited her entire life to tell, but never gave herself permission to say aloud. I was 23. It was the first time someone saw me not for what I did, or how I kept things together, but for who I was beneath all of that. She looked down at her hands. We met at the library. He was the one who introduced me to poetry, Neruda, Rilke, Adrienne, Rich. We'd spend afternoons reading in the park, circling words we didn't understand and trying to write better ones. A smile flickered across her face. I almost left with him, she whispered. We talked about Chicago. About what life would be like away from this town. But then your father asked me to marry him, and he was safe and steady. And my parents approved, so I said yes. I watched her carefully. Did you love him? I asked. Dot. She paused. Yes, in a way. But it wasn't the same kind of love. It was a love I had to grow into, not one that swept me off my feet. She looked at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. Mark wrote me that letter the year you were born. He mailed it to the library because he didn't know where else to reach me. I never wrote back. Why not? Her voice cracked just slightly. Because by then I was someone else. I had you. I had this house. I had a life that was quiet and known, and I didn't want to break it, even if it wasn't perfect. We sat in silence for a long time. Then she said, I kept the letter, not because I regretted not choosing him, but because it reminded me that once I'd been brave enough to imagine something more. I folded the letter and placed it back. Into the book, not as a secret anymore. But as a thread, a part of her story, I finally understood. You know, I said, I used to wonder why you always seemed to mourn something. Even in happy moments, she looked up, and now I realize you weren't mourning what you had. You were mourning what you couldn't name. She didn't speak, but her eyes filled with tears. I stood and crossed the room, and this time, I wrapped my arms around her. She didn't resist. She didn't freeze. She leaned in tired, trembling, human, and I held her like she had once held me. Wordless, worried, warmed out later that night. I opened my journal and wrote, there are women who live entire lives between two decisions, the one they made and the one they never let themselves imagine. I thought of Mark, of the poems, of the way she said Chicago like it was still a doorway, even if it had long since closed, and I thought of my own life. The choices I'd made. The doors I hadn't walked through. Suddenly, I wasn't afraid of my mother's regrets anymore. because I could finally see that she had lived her life holding both love and longing, and survived, and maybe that meant I could too. Part 11 cracks in the frame. I used to tell myself that my marriage was fine, not perfect, not thrilling, but fine. We had a rhythm text about groceries, school pickups, bills due. Evenings spent scrolling on opposite ends of the couch. Conversations reduced to logistics, with love tucked somewhere underneath, like a sweater you wear less and less each season. And somehow, that felt acceptable, because it looked a lot. Like what I'd seen growing up. It wasn't until my daughter asked, "Why don't you and Dad laugh like Uncle Ben and Aunt Claire?" that something inside me cracked. I didn't answer her then. Not because I didn't know, but because I did. We hadn't laughed together in months. That night, after she was asleep, I sat on the edge of the guest bed in my mother's house, staring at the photo on the nightstand. My wedding day, U.S. standing in front of the ivy-covered chapel, smiling. But now, all I could see were the spaces between us, the tiny distance in our hands, the way I had tilted my head but not leaned in. When my mother walked in with folded towels, she paused. At the doorway, "You looked so happy that day," she said, nodding at the frame. "I thought I was," I whispered, "but maybe I just wanted to be." She sat beside me, careful not to crowd me. "Do you regret marrying him?" she asked. I stared at the photo. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I think I regret waiting so long to ask myself that question." She nodded slowly. "When did you know it was changing?" she asked. "Little things," I said. "When?" We stopped saying good morning, when he forgot how I take my coffee, when I stopped telling him about my dreams because I knew he wouldn't really hear them. My voice caught, when I realized I was lonelier next to him than I ever was alone. She was silent for a long moment. "I stayed with your father," she said gently, "because I thought endurance was love. But now I think I was afraid of what would happen if I asked for more." I turned to her. "Do you think I'm just repeating your life?" "No," she said, without hesitation. "I think you're the first woman in our family brave enough to break the silence while there's still time." Her words hit somewhere deep, deeper than I expected. That evening, I called him. Just his name flashing on my screen was enough to send a strange ache through me. A mix of fear and longing. Of habit and hesitation. He answered. His voice was tired. "How is your mom?" he asked. "She's softer than I remember," I said. A pause. "Is that a good thing?" "Yes, it's just surprising." Another pause. Then I asked, "When did we stop talking?" He exhaled. "I don't know. Maybe when we stopped fighting." I nodded to myself. That sounded right, because silence can be louder than yelling. And in our case, it was deafening. "I don't know if we're okay," I said. "I don't either," he admitted. "But I miss you." And for a moment, something stirred. Faint, fragile, but real. "Do you think we could try again?" I asked, not knowing what try even meant anymore. He didn't answer right away. Then, "I think we owe it to ourselves to find out." After we hung up, I went downstairs where my mother was sitting in the dim light, knitting a scarf with slow, practice movements. She looked up. "You called him." I did. "And I don't know," I said, "but we're going to try." She smiled. Trying is a good place to start. I sank into the armchair beside her. And for the first time in a long while, I let myself feel hopeful. Not because everything was fixed, but because I had stopped pretending it was. That night in my journal, I wrote, "Love doesn't disappear. It just gets buried under things we stop saying. But if we're brave enough to speak again, we might still find it waiting." And as the house fell quiet and the clock ticked gently on the wall, I realized something. I wasn't just healing my relationship. I was unlearning generations of silence. Part 12. The soup she never made my daughter had a cold. The kind that turned her cheeks pink and her nose runny and made her little voice rasp. When she asked for water, I planned to make her soup. Carrot and ginger the way I always did when she was sick. But before I could begin chopping, I found my mother already in the kitchen chopping leeks, pulling chicken broth from the pantry, humming something low and old under her breath. You never made soup when I was sick, I said gently. She didn't look up, just kept slicing. I didn't know how. I blinked. How to make soup? No, she said. How to care that way? It was so simple. So direct? It caught me off guard. I used to give you orange juice and send you back to bed. That's how my mother did it. We didn't do warmth. We did functioning. She stirred the pot, then tasted the broth and added more pepper. She was learning. I could see how her hands moved slower now, more thoughtfully, as if nurturing had finally found a home in her fingers. You know, I said quietly, I used to pretend to be sick just to see if you'd notice. Her stirring stopped. She turned to me with eyes full of quiet guilt. I noticed, she said. I just didn't know what to do with noticing. I nodded. Neither of us cried, but we didn't need to. There are apologies that don't come in words. Some come in a bowl of soup. Some come in staying up all night next to a grandchild's bed, changing cool claws and whispering stories into the dark. Later that night, as my daughter finally slept, her little breath slow and steady, I sat in the hallway outside her room. My mother sat beside me. We shared a blanket across our knees like an old truce. She reminds me of you, she said softly. She reminds me of who I wanted to be. I replied. We were both quiet for a while. Then she said, do you remember when you were 9 and you ran away? I laughed. I got as far as the front porch. I watched from the window, she said. You sat out there for hours, holding your backpack like it was armor. I waited for you to come get me, I said. I know, she whispered. But I thought if I let you have space, you'd come back stronger. I turned to her, but what I needed was to be chased. She nodded, tears welling now. I see that. I'm sorry. This time, I reached for her hand, and she let me hold it. We sat like that a long time, and in that moment, I realized we were no longer just mother and daughter. We were women who had both tried and failed, and tried again. That night, I opened my journal and wrote, my mother raised me with hands too tired to soften. But now those same hands stir soup, wipe foreheads, and hold mine in the hallway at midnight. Maybe it's never too late to become the mother you couldn't be before. Down the hall, my daughter stirred in her sleep and whispered my name. I got up to check on her, but my mother was already at the door. Part 13, the voicemail that didn't belong. It started with a misdial, or maybe fate has a different sense of timing than we do. I was searching through my phone for an old voice memo, something I recorded from my daughter's second birthday. When I stumbled on a voicemail, I didn't recognize Dot. It was dated 3 weeks ago. The number wasn't saved, but the voice didn't feel like a stranger. Anne, I know you might not want to hear from me. I've thought about calling 100 times, and each time I've stopped myself. But this morning, I heard a woman laugh in the cafe, and it sounded just like you did once on a bus in winter. I don't need anything. I just wanted to tell you. I remember. I still remember. Click. I sat frozen for a long time. I knew. The name before I said it out loud, Dot marked out the man in the letter. The one she didn't choose. I don't know why the message came to me. Maybe he found my number through the library archives. Maybe he searched my name and guessed. Maybe it was pure accident, but the weight of it sat in my chest like a secret I hadn't meant to carry. I didn't tell her right away. Instead, I walked for hours through the neighborhood, past the houses that had always looked too perfect, past my childhood school, past the bench at the park where I once sat with my first love, pretending the world was simpler than it was. When I returned home, my mother was in the kitchen again, rearranging the same jar of tea bags she'd organized a dozen times already. I watched her from the hallway. She looked older today, not in the tired way, in the softened way, like someone who had finally stopped holding her breath. I have something, I said. I think it's yours. She turned. When I played the voicemail, she stood still as stone. I expected a reaction, tears. Denial, panic. But when the voice ended, she simply whispered, "He still remembers." And then she smiled, not with joy. With peace. "I thought he might have forgotten me," she said. "Do you want to call him back?" She looked out the window where the garden was fading into autumn. "No," she said. "I think I just needed to know I hadn't imagined it, that what I felt was real. That someone still remembers who I was before I turned into this." I didn't ask what this meant. I knew. She meant the woman who made dinners with clenched shoulders. The woman who kept silent during arguments. The mother who didn't know how to hold a crying child without shushing them. She meant the woman she had tried not to become. And yet, standing here now, I could see how much of her was still intact. Still quietly beautiful. "You were never invisible," I said softly. "You were just exhausted." She turned to me. Her eyes shone. "Do you think it's too late to be remembered for something else?" "No," I said. "But it might mean letting people see the parts you used to hide." She smiled faintly. "That's the hardest part." "I know," I said. "I'm learning too." That night, we sat outside together on the porch, wrapped in old blankets, watching the trees bend under the weight of early October wind. We didn't talk about Mark again, not because it didn't matter, but because we didn't need to. The past had surfaced. It had been seen. And now we were both learning how to lay it down without shame. I looked at her hands in the dim light, older now, veined and careful, and yet still the same hands that had held mine when I was small, even if I hadn't always noticed. "Thank you," I said. "For what?" "For staying. Even when you didn't know how to be soft. Even when you didn't know what I needed. You stayed." She looked away, and for the first time in years, I saw her eyes truly wet with tears. "I tried," she whispered. And in that moment, I understood. Sometimes trying is the truest form of love. Part 14. Why don't we eat together? The table was set for 3, nothing fancy, just soup, warm bread, and my daughter's favorite lemonade in a pitcher with lemon slices floating at the top. She had asked earlier that day if Grandma could stay for dinner. Like a real family dinner, she said, eyes wide with hope. Where everyone sits down at the same time. I hesitated. Because in our house, dinners were rarely like that. When I was growing up, dinner meant plates passed in silence, clinking, forks, and my father disappearing halfway through to take a call. When I got married, it became fast food eaten at separate times, after long work days and longer silences, but my daughter had asked with such innocent expectation that something inside me softened, and so I cooked. My mother set the table, and for the first time in years, we sat down together. Halfway through her soup, my daughter looked up and asked, "Why didn't we do this before?" I looked to my mother. She looked to me. I opened my mouth to answer, but the truth caught in my throat. My daughter waited, spoon in hand. And finally, my mother said, "Because we didn't know how to sit still." My daughter blinked. "That's silly." I laughed gently. "It is, isn't it?" She nodded. "You just sit and eat and talk." She said it like it was the simplest thing in the world, and maybe it was. But for us, it had taken years, wounds, distance, 1,000 meals eaten with clenched jaws and lonely hearts. Now, here we were together. My mother reached for the basket of bread. "You used to love dinner rolls," she said to me. "I still do." I smiled. "I remember," she said, and I saw in her face a small pride. The pride of remembering a detail she hadn't said aloud in decades. My daughter, full of warmth and soup and sunshine, said, "This feels like the best day." And I realized then she wouldn't remember the silence. She would remember this table, this soup, this moment where 3 women, one growing, one healing, one remembering, had found a place to breathe together. After dinner, we cleared the table in a kind of quiet rhythm I'd never known with my mother before. No sharp orders, no tension. Just the soft passing of plates and napkins, the shared clink of dishes. When my daughter was tucked in later that night, I found my mother still sitting at the table, hands folded in her lap, eyes lost in thought. "Do you think I ruined your childhood?" She asked Dot. The question was so bare, so exposed, that I almost couldn't answer. But I sat beside her and said, "I think you did the best you could with what you had. And I think you're helping me make sure my daughter has something different." She nodded. "I wish I'd had what you're giving her." "I think we're giving it to her together," I said. She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. It was such a small gesture, but in that one touch was everything. Apology, gratitude, love, and the ache of what might have been if only someone had taught her to sit still, to eat slowly, to speak gently. Later, as I turned out the lights and climbed into bed, I wrote in my journal, "There are dinners we eat in silence, and then there are dinners that heal us, spoon by spoon." Tonight, I tasted both forgiveness and rosemary, and for the first time, they felt the same. Tomorrow we would wake up and life would still be messy, but tonight, 3 plates had been cleared, 3 chairs filled, and 3 hearts had softened in the same room at the same time. Part 15, the quiet thunderstorm. The morning came soft. No alarms, no rushing. Just the sound of rain tapping gently on the kitchen windows and my daughter's feet padding across the hallway floor. She curled beside me under the quilt, whispering, "It's raining," like it was a secret between us. And for once, I didn't think of emails or laundry or what came next. I just lay there, holding her, letting the world be small. Downstairs, I could hear the kettle whistle my mother's hands, already moving in the rhythm of morning. But this morning felt different. As if something sacred had passed between us in recent days. Unspoken, but understood. When I came down, she was already pouring tea. "You slept in," she said, handing me a mug. "You made chamomile?" I smiled. "You never made chamomile when I was young." She looked at me for a long moment, then said, "I'm learning to soften where I used to tighten." We sat for a while, drinking in silence. Then I reached into the drawer and pulled out the old tin box she kept letters in, some faded, some unopened, all quietly humming with history. I slid it across the table. "You can take these with you," she said. I shook my head. "I think they belong here." With your story." Her fingers hesitated on the lid. "I didn't know I had a story," she whispered. "I just thought I had regrets." I reached for her hand. "You have both, but also you have time." She looked up at me, eyes full, voice fragile. "I didn't think you'd forgive me," she said. "I didn't think I would either," I replied. But then I saw you watching her sleep, tucking the blanket around her shoulders. And I remembered that the same hands that once didn't know how to hold me were trying now. She nodded, tears quietly falling, not dramatic, not loud, just honest. We didn't say much more. But that night, before bed, my daughter came running with a drawing clutched in her hands. It was us. 3 stick figures, 1 tall, 1 medium, 1 small. We were holding hands beneath a big yellow sun and a rainbow that arched from corner to corner. She'd labeled them with crooked letters, me, mommy, grandma, and underneath, "Our house is where love gets better." I stared at the words. My mother did too. She pulled my daughter into her arms, her voice trembling. "You're right, sweetheart. We're getting better every day." Later that evening, as the house dimmed into the hush of bedtime, I stood in the doorway of my childhood room. The wallpaper was peeling a little. The dresser still had that old scratch on the side from when I was 12 and slammed it too hard. But tonight, it felt like a place that had forgiven itself. I picked up my journal one last time and wrote, "Not all mothers start out soft. Some learn softness later through loss, through age, through watching their daughters become the kind of mothers they once wished they could be. But even weathered hands can hold love gently. And sometimes the greatest healing is not in being raised perfectly, but in raising each other again as adults with grace and grief and tenderness. May sleep find you gently tonight. May you remember that healing doesn't erase. What hurt, it simply gives it a place to rest. Greater than the story ends here. Sleep well. Dream sweetly.